Welcome to DIF 2018, the world's largest online festival that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? One of this year's key topics is materials and design, and that's what we're going to talk about today. In the upcoming 30 minutes, I'm joined by biodesigner Natsai and biologist Christina. They're going to tell us all about what they learn in nature and how they implement that with their design thinking projects geared towards a better future. For everybody online, this is an interactive festival. We want your engagement. There is a question/comments box next to this session on the webpage. There is also social media. Use the hashtag ThinkDiff on any of the social media to get in touch and ask questions for Natsai and Christina. I'll be putting them through to them. And just to start off, Natsai, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much, Kinga, for the intro. It's really great to be here. So my name is Natsai Audrey Chieza, and I am a designer who's working at the intersection of emerging technology, synthetic biology, design. My design background is actually architecture. So I studied architecture at Edinburgh many years ago now, and found myself really interested in how designing and systems could happen at different scales. And so soon after I completed my studies, I decided to study material futures at Central St. Martin's. And this was about materiality. It was about taking into consideration the technology that enables us to craft with materials and really setting out that context. And while I was studying, I became really interested in synthetic biology, this idea that you could design at a molecular scale. And that sort of blew my mind because I thought, okay, what are the tools? What are the systems? What is the knowledge that someone needs to be able to do this? So I started experimenting really with microbes. And at the time, in a collaboration with Professor John Ward at University College London, who really allowed me to play with a lot of ideas as well as microbes around the idea of making with. And so we started experimenting with the pigment producing bacterium, quickly discovered you could dye textiles with it. Added bonus was that, we're using a huge amount of, or rather the opposite, a lot less water than ordinarily found in industry, up to 500 times less water than in industry. And we were also reducing chemical use. And that's when, for me, there was this connection that was made. That potentially, if we decided to move towards designing with living systems, we could start to actually find more sustainable methods of fabrication. And many years later, I founded Faber Features, which is really a biodesign lab and consultancy that's working with multiple stakeholders to think about how we can design more sustainable futures using biology and technologies in synthetic biology, which Christina is an expert in. So maybe now is a good time, Christina.
Introduce myself?
Introduce yourself, yes.
Go for it. I'm Christina Agapakis. I'm a biologist by training. I became obsessed at a very young age with biochemistry, which I'm really interested in how biology does things right at this very, very tiny scale and how it can impact things at an enormous scale. You brought up scale, and I think we'll talk about it again later. As a student and in college, I definitely thought that biology meant I was going to have some sort of impact in biomedicine, and really thought about myself as someone working in pharmacology or a kind of like medical context. Like if you can manipulate biology, if you can do things with living cells, that's about sort of understanding the human body and making therapeutics. And it wasn't until I started graduate school with that kind of frame of reference that I then encountered synthetic biology, which was sort of asking this question of like, okay, well, if we can apply these sorts of ideas of engineering and design to living things, could we make other stuff? And what might that other stuff be? And what would that world look like? And that sort of like creative opening of just that question that the woman who became my thesis advisor, Pam Silver, asked me when I first met her was really eye-opening. And so it was like, oh, it's not just about disease and health. Biology is actually about the world around us, all of the materials and the things that we see, and all of the things that we do and make. And anytime there's an interaction with physical stuff, you have an interaction with something that could be made by or processed by or connected to biology and ecosystems in nature. And so that and I was sort of focused to it, and so like I'm going to learn a lot about these enzymes that make biofuels, and I sort of became sort of obsessed with these like tiny pieces of tiny enzymes, and the smaller and smaller I got in it, the bigger and bigger the problem actually seemed. And I was really having a hard time bridging that gap, not just about like how do you solve that or even understand the problems that we're trying to solve when you're talking about energy or sort of materials or environmental issues, but also just the social piece of it too. How do we get people, how do we like connect everybody? How do we have this thing be something that makes sense to people? How do we make it usable? And all those pieces. And so it wasn't really until I started talking to designers, folks like you, Natsai, and sort of in this group of people who are thinking about designing biology from the context of design. Mm-hmm. And the questions that they were asking were the kinds of questions that I didn't realize I needed, but really did. And so I've been since then really thinking about biology and sort of my background in these tiny things in the context of biology, of design. So how do we, might we use design and art maybe to communicate, to explore new connections and to build new things that make sense in their context. Mm-hmm. So now I'm the creative director at Ginkgo Bioworks. We're a synthetic biology company. We're working to build the tools that make biology easier to engineer, and via those tools make new kinds of products, systems, things in partnership with lots of different people in lots of different industries. Because I think we see the impact and the potential of biology to do lots of different things, whether it's in health or agriculture or materials or chemistry or energy and all of these different things. And so we're building those tools and those systems to be able to communicate and build these new products.
And so what are some of the areas that you feel synthetic biology can really have impact in the context of circular economy, some of the big issues, right? I'm thinking of people talk about this is the fourth industrial revolution and biology is going to be central to it. What do you think biology's role is in the next 100 years?
That's a big question, but I think that biology is everything, right? You just biology is can I think play a role in anything that is a physical object, anything that is a physical thing has a material flow to it, can be connected to biology or is already connected to biology in many ways, in ways that we may not realize. But I think when you're definitely talking about us, our bodies, so like medicine, health, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Our food, what we eat, is biology. How we grow food, where we grow it, how it's made, how to make those flows more sustainable, with fewer maybe external or chemical inputs from petroleum. Can we incorporate more biological sources of energy into our agricultural system? So at Ginkgo, we have a joint venture with Bayer Crop Sciences called Join Bio. That company is all about trying to engineer bacteria that live in the soil that can provide energy to the plants and fertilizer to plants. So that's sort of, there's an agricultural element, food element, obviously, and then materials. So I think when you look at the work that you do, right? So you can dye the bacteria, and so dye is a really interesting chemical industry. Now the vast majority of the dye that we use is made via synthetic chemistry and petroleum, but you're asking a really interesting question about, can you have new methods and new techniques that bring biology back to textiles, and therefore make more sustainable design of dyes. The material, the fabric itself, was once all natural. Now we're using a lot of synthetics in our textile processes. But there's companies like Bolt Threads that are looking at making using proteins to make fabric. So they're making spider silk in yeast using synthetic biology. So there's really that's just a couple examples. But I think we say sort of anytime there's a physical object, there's a way to do it. And so Natsai, I mean, you brought up the fourth industrial revolution. I think I love in your work and in the work of designers who are in this field, like how you can do that big picture contextualization of this kind of work along those frameworks. So I would love, maybe you can introduce some of those concepts and where you see biology making impact.
So, and I think, Natsai, sorry to introduce, but I've heard you mentioning fabrics and how to use microbials to dye it. And Christina just mentioned as well, maybe it's nice for you to also explain a bit more into detail what you've done on that project.
Yeah, sure. I think I can definitely get into that.
You can show a visual.
Yeah, maybe. So Christina,
why don't you talk? I'll find a picture and I can put it up a screen share or something.
Tag team, that's excellent. Yeah. So Christina, you make such a good point. Designers are really good at seeing that bigger context, being able to see, I think, tiny parts and how they can aggregate to become something much larger and impact the world in a certain way. I think we're becoming more conscious, right, of how we design a system for it to do something. And so at Faber Futures, one of the big challenges that we've sort of faced is trying to understand emerging technologies, emerging biotechnologies, synthetic biology in the context of ecology, in the context of culture, in the context of materials, and in the context of futures. And so we have a framework that is ecology, cultures, materiality, frontiers at Faber Futures, and we explore these technologies from those four prisms. And so I think the question that underpins everything we're doing is, how do we redefine our relationship with nature? How do we start to design in a way that perhaps moves beyond human-centered design and acknowledges that there are multiple species in the world? And so how do we design for a multi-species agenda? For example, in cultures, we're asking, how do we enable people to, first of all, understand what these technologies mean, so that they can have an opinion, a point of view, but also changing mindsets across industry and institutions so that they can really start to understand how these technologies are going to impact what they do. And for me, this has been a long journey of being, a designer working in a lab, completely off the books, with no framework, with no institution validation, if you like. And so how do we open up new spaces, and how do we allow people to know that they have to accommodate, different points of view from within? And we can talk a little bit more about how you're doing that at Ginkgo. And then materiality, this is where we really start to interrogate materials that are biological. And what has always driven me as a designer working in this space is to try and find design strategies, design-centered strategies of working with living systems. So knowing that a microbe can produce pigment and therefore you can dye textiles with it. Okay, for me, that was wild to begin with. But I quickly realized that where we are going to find something really interesting is if, as a designer, I start to really push those scientific protocols to answer design questions. And so when we're working with any microorganism, there is this prism of, problem solving within contextual-based studies that design is really good at. In other words, if we can dye textiles using microbes, how is one brand going to do it over another? In terms of trying to find some kind of differentiation in how they produce those artifacts. And how do we as designers or as textile designers need to reconfigure how we work with materials to accommodate these new processes? We want these processes because potentially they could really shift the ecological impact of material production and consumption. And then finally in frontiers, this is where we experiment with big ideas that are going to take a few years for them to become mainstream. We worked on a project with an engineer from Ginkgo, looking at embedding DNA metadata into a pigment sample, so that one day you can retrieve the information about that pigment sample using some kind of forensics. And that's really interesting to us, DNA as storage. So the big ideas, I suppose, happen in this framework. They overlap, obviously. But I think it's always important to have, this touch point where you know where the work can belong. And that's, I think, what helps start mapping out that bigger picture and try to relate it back to the microscopic. And I was saying earlier, Christine, I don't know if you can see the visuals.
Yeah, it's up now. So that's your, that's one of the pieces that you made while you were in residence at Ginkgo.
Yeah, it feels like eons ago. Do you want to talk about that?
The residency?
Yeah.
Yeah. Should I? Well, so first I'll mention a little bit about the piece and why I think it's so exciting. So you didn't talk about, so the bacteria is a species of bacteria that produces these pigments naturally, and depending on the pH of the acidity of the medium that it's in, it can be either pink or blue. And each piece that Natsai makes with these bacteria growing directly on the silk is unique because of the biology. She's working in collaboration with these living organisms to create this pattern. And I love how the craft and the technique that Natsai brings to it can kind of show how biology is really good at kind of creating this variability, this variation, this uniqueness within a certain context. So I think you can make each one, it's not like a factory where you're going to make 10 million of the same thing. Each of these has billions and billions of cells, but they're all slightly different. And all of those little differences are what makes biology really special. And something that is really interesting when you start to think about how might you transform our industrial systems thinking about biology and using design principles from biology.
And this kind of it feels for me like as a project, it was always evident to me that design in synthetic biology, for example, is something that didn't have to be the science communication. It could drive what that thing is. And I was so excited when you were really open to the idea of opening up, residency programming at Ginkgo as a vehicle to bring the sort of diverse and multitudes of way in which designers design systems, environments.
And we actually have a question coming in around this. The question is, how broadly applicable is dyeing fabrics with bacteria? Can we use any fabric for it?
So using this process, we work with a range of different fabrics. We have spent most of our time experimenting with protein-based yarns. So silks, wool, the dye uptake is most successful that way. But I say that after about 7 years of working on this. The other day we experimented with a recycled polyester, and it works beautifully. And that to me is really fascinating, that you think and then biology does something different.
Yeah, and I actually have another question when you say that, because you say the result turns out to be working really well. Do you use any prototyping tools? Is it all physical, or do you also use computers or artificial intelligence?
That's a really good question. So the processes that I've been working with have been handcrafted mechanisms of working with fermentation processes. But what happens at Ginkgo is precisely what you're kind of, I think, preempting. Maybe, Christina, you can talk a little bit about that.
Sorry, what was the, what can I tell you about Ginkgo?
So the question was, are we using computational tools, for example, to model the prototyping?
Right.
We're working predominantly with craft-based making, fermenting, but what you guys do kind of takes it up a level.
Yeah, so I think it is what is really interesting, and one of, I think, the challenges of building these kinds of collaborations and kind of cross-disciplinary connections is that we use words differently, and we can be using sometimes the same language, but we mean very, very different things. So at Ginkgo, we have a design team. Our design team is made primarily of computational biologists who are building software to model and design DNA sequences and what kind of impact those DNA sequences might have on the cell. So our design teams are really are designing at the DNA level. They're thinking about the enzymes, the machines inside of the cell that might be producing these kinds of compounds, and how to design computationally the different systems that we're going to produce different levels of those pigments, for example, or produce them in response to different signals. They could sense something and respond differently. So the computation is very, very important to the way that Ginkgo designs and how we work. We're building all kinds of software and models and things to scale our processes. And so it is really interesting to see where that really intersected with Natsai's design and practice, and the way that she was really bringing this more craft and intuitive based practice to it. So the computation, happens, there's sort of like an upstream downstream question, and bringing Natsai to the lab really kind of brought the ideas or at least like an awareness of the kind of downstream kind of design up into the lab. So, when you're working directly with folks on our design team, we have one of the people who's helping us is advising our current residency is the head of our design team, and so his name is Josh Dunn, and he's a really interesting person who can kind of bridge again between his role as a computational systems biologist and interacting with someone who is kind of building more using design methods that are a little more traditional design. That
blew my mind when I came to Ginkgo, because I had perhaps a more conservative view of what is design, which really shocked me. I didn't know this about myself. But then realizing that if we are designing at a molecular scale, that requires a completely different skill base, set of knowledge. He's designing organisms. It is still design, and so those same bigger picture aspects of that we are considering, around sustainability, around equitable business models, for example, they are going to at some point intersect with what Josh and his team are working on, because presumably they are designing in response to, if they're working with particular companies to build something that might replace a harmful chemical here and there. They are still designing to that end. And I think that's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that, Christina, you've mentioned a bit earlier already is skill. Mm-hmm. And I think that fits really well with this discussion around computational design versus more traditional ways of using design. Can you elaborate a bit more on skill?
It's a good question. So it's a question that I've been asked recently, like to think about, if there's this new discipline of biodesign that is these, what are the skills to train someone who is a biodesigner?
Sorry, Christina, you dropped a little bit. Can you maybe start this sentence from the beginning?
Sure. I was saying, this question has come up recently of what are the skills or things that you might need to train somebody to become a biodesigner. If this is becoming a new discipline that is the intersection of two or many disciplines now, what are the things that you might put in a curriculum? What are the skills that you would expect somebody who's a biodesigner to have? I think I think right now, or where I'm sort of thinking about it, I don't want to be too prescriptive. I think there are many different skills, and people sort of land along a very wide spectrum. I think, if you're going to get a job on Ginkgo's design team, I think having really strong programming and computational skills is essential. You're going to need another set of skills entirely that maybe Natsai can comment on. But there will be people who I think are hybrid. And that hybridity, I think right now, as this field is being designed, design, literally, as it's being formed, is really necessary. So it is the people who I think are sort of willing to be uncomfortable and out of their depth and over their head in one or the other. So I started as a biologist. That's all of my professional training and my knowledge is in biology. But I've spent a lot of time being kind of, a little bit uncomfortable, or asking questions, or getting to know people who are trained very differently from me, and kind of coming to a point of sort of mutual respect and trying to understand. And then vice versa, I think there's people who are trained really in very deeply knowledgeable in certain kinds of design, who then come and spend time in a lab where you'd have no idea what's going on, and have that those moments of discomfort as you build new kinds of skills and make those connections. So I think more than anything, the skill that's actually important is that kind of willingness and openness to be in a different place, and asking a different kind of question, and that's the important thing for biodesign for me.
I completely agree. I think it's such a difficult thing to define what is biodesign. I think we get fixated on putting something in a box so that we can better understand it, but actually the skill bases, or the skill sets that you're describing, are actually the kinds of skills that more and more people in the world in general are going to need to have, precisely because of the fourth industrial revolution and the complexity that it brings to us. If we are talking about artificial intelligence, if we're talking about just even the notion of 5G, faster broadband, and the fact that that is going to enable systems to talk to each other, the Internet of Things. That's, for me, where it becomes necessary that whatever anyone is doing, the challenges I think that we're facing as a species, and then more broadly as individuals, trying to figure out how this technology is going to affect our future. I think we do need a hybrid approach.
It's actually really interesting. Drew Endy, who is a really important figure in synthetic biology, a sort of early pioneer in the field, and he's a really interesting thinker now in some of these questions. And he's recently been asking sort of, or pointing out, like, we have relatively, like, we're getting pretty good on literacy, right? Like, many people can read and write, almost like that's, I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's high now. Like, people can read and write, and that's wonderful. And that's really a big change from, a few hundred years ago. And it has huge implications to our society. We're having also like an increased set of percentage of people who are literate in sort of computer kind of language, people who can code. And we have this huge push of to learn to code as in schools, and for people to be literate in how computers think, and to be able to converse with computers almost, right? And that's a really big push, and a lot of effort going into that to say, these technologies are dominant in our lives now and are going to be impacting, and there's a question of sort of ethics and values and skills that we need to build to be able to be participating in that kind of economy. And then he asked, well, so how many people are literate in DNA code? In reading and writing DNA. And that number right now is much smaller. And there's a question of, like, how many people do we need? Is that something that, like, we should be striving for literacy to the point we have, reading, writing, language, human language? Should we have people, what are the training, how do you train people to be literate in reading and writing DNA? And so that question, I think, is really interesting. And so as a field of synthetic biology, people have spent a lot of time thinking about that, sort of how do you build those frameworks for building that kind of literacy. So there's a program called iGEM, the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition. Oh, actually, I see, are these technologies open source? Which is a perfect question, because iGEM is really built on an open source model. So undergraduates and high school students from around the world will start from a set of open source tools to read and write DNA, and they build their own new systems, design a microbe effectively for over the summer, and then contribute all of they've engineered back. And so there is a sense of, to build that to build a community, to build a set of people who are literate in this, and to build the starting point for doing this kind of engineering and making that kind of impact, that you have to have this sort of this openness at the base of the kind of basic techniques and things that you can, the tools that you can use, so that everyone can use them and everybody can be using them to design things in their own contexts.
And just to make it clear for the people watching at home, this was actually a question that was asked. Are these technologies open source? It was a question from the audience. I think it's a really interesting topic because you really talk a lot about designers. And do you particularly target designers when you think of biology and how to make it understandable and usable for as many people as possible? Or how do you go across that?
I think that there
yeah, I think go ahead. Go ahead and say.
I think that there are lots of ways to do that. Oh wait, I'm going to let Christina start because, yes, go ahead.
I think there's different layers. I think, yes, absolutely, design is essential to how you, design these systems and these communities. We have design of the sort of objects and products and sort of frameworks. You have design that's important in the communication. I think it's everywhere. So to make these things, I've been looking at this. I have this. So like, I'm also thinking a lot about kind of values and communication. And when you're talking about genetic engineering and synthetic biology, I think we also have a lot of history, and Natsai, you brought up business models and equitable practices and all these things. And I think when you look at the history of genetic engineering, typically those fall on the sort of bad side. Like, it's like, oh, that's just bad. And I think what's interesting when designers kind of come in and are part of the conversation upstream, we can have different conversations about values and about those things and how we might design them. And so, like, I make these stickers and I hand them out because I want to sort of show why I think that genetic engineering and synthetic biology can be a force for good. But it shows that we have to also be thinking about those values from the beginning, and to make those products that are
I think
going to have a positive impact.
It's if you have built something that's worthwhile, then you can communicate that. But where design was, I think, within the context of science, at least culturally, was that it was the communication of whatever else had happened. I think designers are very good at asking questions of, like you said, Christina, creating a framework to understand something from a different point of view or understand how it might function in a different way. And so when I think design is happening at all of these layers, it's kind of a de facto scenario. And I really think that as this field kind of expands, design in the same way that we have seen it within computation. I mean, come on, we wouldn't have an iPhone if it wasn't for good design. We don't talk about the technology inside. We talk about the experience of that. And I think that synthetic biology is going to definitely be a space where all of this influence means that we're not talking necessarily just about the how. We'll be talking about the why and how it empowers people and how it adds value to people's lives. And I think that's the power, I think, that design can, or the role it can play upstream.
And we're running out of time a little bit, unfortunately. I think this conversation could have gone on for a very long time. I want to finish it
Call
up.
us. Let's keep going.
People can still ask questions, I guess. But I want to wrap it up with one question, and you've mentioned it before. You really see that biodesign, synthetic biology is a force that can change our future, our world. Can you give us like a few sentences of the why on that?
For me, it's about connections, and ecosystems. So my 3-year-old is home. So sorry if you hear some screaming. If you have I think the microbiome and the way that it's bringing to the fore these different conceptions of ourselves as individuals and as communities, I think that to me is so special, because I think it helps us rethink of our bodies and our connections to nature, and sort of, so I'm really interested, or where I see a real potential is the change in the way of our thinking of ourselves as a part of nature, and the communities that we can build and the connections that we build to the environment around us.
Mm-hmm. I feel like my answer is precisely that. It's we have the potential to redefine our relationship with nature, and we have the most powerful tools to be able to do that. And those tools can do extraordinarily good work, and they can do terrible work. And I think we have to quickly figure out what this is, so that we can actually build a future that we all want. And that, for me, is a really powerful promise that these tools can afford us.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for joining us today for this session. I've learned a lot. I hope everybody watching as well. This session has ended, but the diff certainly not. One other session, it's not really a session, but something that I want to point out too is the diff learner journey. It's a special feature for this year's diff, where we're inviting you to go on an interactive journey to learn more about the circular economy. You can find it on our homepage. That's it from us for now. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.